I'd ask if you're not speaking to please mute your microphone just so that we don't get background noise and we can hear from our presenters. We have some upcoming meetings. You'll see we've been very active in trying to schedule these sessions for information gathering that the task force is doing primarily in the month of October. So please do note there's a number of convenings. We have one tomorrow at 9 a.m. We'll be meeting with the Judiciary. And on Monday, we've got a meeting with our housing providers. We've got a lot going on, so please do join us. We appreciate your joining as much as you possibly can, as your schedules permit. Again, we're recording these so that in the event you cannot attend, you can still listen in. But it's helpful to be here because, of course, then you can ask questions. And that's part of our charge, is to really explore the resources, the people that we're bringing to these sessions, so it can inform our work. So, and there will be time as to questions. There will be time for questions after the presentations. We can certainly be iterative and take some of them. If you're here outside, if you're listening in, we'd ask that you put those questions in the chat. We'll be monitoring that as we go along. We certainly know we want to take questions at the end of the presenters too, but we want to keep to time so that we get to hear from everybody. All right. So with that, we're really not going to do much more, and we're going to begin with the information that we're privileged to hear today. There are others who are involved with this work in establishing a right to counsel in eviction cases. We don't have to go it alone. We have others who've been engaged and involved and have implemented or are in the process of implementing a civil right to counsel in eviction cases. So this is our opportunity to learn from them, to hear from them, to understand what the challenges are, where the successes are, so that we can be successful in Maryland in implementing our Access to Counsel initiative. So we're going to begin. You have the agenda. We're going to start with the other state, the first state that is implementing a civil right to counsel in evictions, and that is the state of Washington. So we're going to start with James Bamberger, who kindly has come. He authored the implementation report that you all have access to, and so he's going to talk about that and give us some insights into the work that they're doing in Washington. So without further ado, James, I don't know if we'll call James, but if you would kindly unmute and tell us about the civil right to counsel in Washington, and maybe, really the structure. We've talked to you a little bit about some of the areas we'd like you to explore. So thank you very much, and let's get started.
Well, thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes, you can.
Okay. I apologize for my lack of formal dress. I would normally be wearing nice clothes, but I'm on vacation. But it is a real joy and pleasure to be with you today. My goal is to just kind of frame out, maybe put a little bit more meat on the framework that you've seen in the context of our implementation plan, the components of the law, the components of our delivery mechanism, and where we are today. So let me just start first with a very brief introduction to the Office of Civil Legal Aid, or OCLA, we call it. The office was created in 2005 by the state legislature. We are an independent agency in the judicial branch of government. I am the director of the agency, and I'm appointed by the Supreme Court and serve at the Supreme Court's pleasure. But that is the extent of the Supreme Court's involvement with the agency. As I say, we are independent and generally charged with administering state funding for civil legal aid services across the state. We run 2 right to counsel programs now by statute. The first program we have run since 2014 is our Children's Legal Representation Program for certain children in child welfare cases. And then now our Right to Counsel program in the tenant defense area. The Right to Counsel program in the tenant defense area was created by Senate Bill 5160, which passed this last legislative session and became effective on April 22nd. The Senate bill created, it was kind of like the legislature's comprehensive response to the eviction crisis our state is facing, and I assume every other state is facing. And they came up with a multifaceted approach to protecting residential tenancies and stability of housing, while at the same time addressing the very significant shortfalls that occurred during the pandemic and are continuing to occur during the pandemic in terms of non-payment of rent. And so there were three principal components. The first is the expansion of a novel, kind of first of its kind in the nation, eviction diversion program that we worked with our state Superior Court Judges Association to create. It's called the Eviction Resolution Pilot Program. We ran that starting last November in 6 of the largest counties of the state, and it was really designed to bring landlords, tenants, counsel, and rent assistance providers to the table with trained eviction resolution specialists in each county to see how we can deal with past due rent, development of payment plans, access rent assistance, and really move cases away from the trajectory of going into the court system and getting them resolved in a manner that solves the economic relationship or resolves the economic relationship between landlords and tenants who have fallen behind in their rent. So prong number one of Senate Bill 5160 was to take it from 6 counties to all 37 judicial districts in our state. And that has been operationalized effective this last month. In addition, the state legislature both received a very substantial sum of TRAP 1 and TRAP 2 Treasury rent assistance funding, and in addition appropriated a significant amount of state rent assistance funding, and is funding essentially a comprehensive approach to making rent assistance available, which is essentially the grease, if you will, in the wheels of our eviction resolution pilot programs. Unfortunately, like many states, the rollout of rent assistance has been extremely slow, in many places almost non-existent, and we're working hard with the governor's office and with the State Department of Commerce and local governments that were direct recipients of TRAP funding to accelerate the availability and to reduce the administrative hoops and barriers that have really made it difficult for tenants and landlords to access the program. The third prong, which is the one I think you're most interested in, is a new responsibility or duty that was imposed on our courts. Essentially, the bill says courts must appoint counsel in unlawful detainer, that's our term for eviction cases, before they may proceed. So if you have an indigent tenant who is a defendant in an unlawful detainer case, the court is required to appoint counsel. And what we've done is we have, and then finally the legislature assigned administration of the program and the duty to stand up what we call the Right to Counsel or RTC program to the Office of Civil Legal Aid. Our first responsibility was to develop an implementation plan. We were given 90 days to do it. we convened a very comprehensive and multidisciplinary implementation planning group. We identified 11 areas of implementation focus, from intake, screening, equity, training, support, infrastructure, and on and on. And we were given 90 days, we produced the plan in 75 days. We were given a year to stand the program up, meaning we had to operationalize every one of the components of the plan, including developing the eviction defense screening line, which is a statewide hotline with 20 full-time screeners on the hotline, building out our case management system infrastructure, and creation of a special module in our case management system for all participating and contracted eviction right to counsel programs, and I'll go into that in a second. We had to adopt a training and develop a training protocol. We have 15 hours of mandatory training for each and every attorney who is engaged in the full-time practice of eviction defense. We had to work with the courts in all 37 judicial districts to adopt a standing order or a written protocol or agreement pursuant to which they would identify and screen and appoint counsel, OCLA approved and contracted counsel in these cases where they have an indigent tenant defendant. We had to build out our infrastructure, develop and purchase access to statewide interpreter services, develop, as I say, the training, including racial justice training, which is actually going to take place next week on Tuesday, build out LEP and ADA compliance protocols and systems and the like. We've done all of that, and in almost every place we have hired and trained the lawyers who will be dedicated full-time to the representation of tenants in eviction cases pursuant to court appointment. We have also secured protocols or standing orders in about 30 of the 37 judicial districts. And we just this past Monday certified the first 19 programs, 19 counties. And our certification is the condition precedent to any court, A, appointing counsel in a case, and B, hearing any case involving an indigent tenant. So under the law, and as we secured an interpretive letter from our Office of the Attorney General, under the law, OCLA certification is the mandatory condition precedent before a court can proceed to hear any eviction case involving indigent tenants. Now, we've had some courts chafe at that, as you can imagine, but for the most part, they are in compliance, and those courts that are out of compliance have been advised that we will be challenging, our lawyers will be challenging the validity of any writ that has issued in any of the cases prior to OCLA certification. Excuse me. Among the counties that we certified this week are the state's largest counties, actually 5 of the 6 states' largest counties, representing more than 70% of historical eviction filings, unlawful detainer filings. And then finally, we have engaged a research team at the University of Washington's Evans School for Public Policy and Governance to do a longitudinal assessment of the impact and effectiveness and outcomes realized by the RTC program over time, They will have to develop interim reports. A report is due to the legislature a year from now, and then another report a year from then. And that work has already begun. It's been a very busy time, a heady time. I certainly stand to be corrected, but I am unaware of another. There are many, many, many different definitions of right to counsel programs. My sense and understanding is that ours is the only one, certainly the only statewide one, that imposes the responsibility on the courts themselves to appoint counsel as a condition precedent to proceeding to hear the cases. I'm super happy to answer questions that you may have. I'd like to just drop, and I'm not sure, I'm not a Teams person, but I'd like to find a way to drop just a link to our website that has the press release that we issued yesterday and has materials relating to the implementation. I think I can do it. Nope. Okay, anybody want to help me figure out how to do that?
Sure,
Yeah,
we can.
I'm happy to, if you can either email it to me or I can find it on your website and post it into the chat.
Is that, well, I can show you the website and you can go there. Okay. So I'll show you the website. There it is, oklawa.gov reports. Here's the press release. I think you can see it. Yes?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Here's the press release. Here's the implementation plan, which you have. And here's the updated status by county of our implementation efforts. So feel free to go there. And again, I'm happy to answer any questions. Now, how the heck do I get out of that?
There, can you close that? We'll see.
Yeah, we'll see.
Okay. Jim, I have to ask you a question. Are you able to stay on with us for this session? We know you're on vacation and you've been kind enough to join us.
I have blocked the time.
Okay. All right. Then what we may do is, if we can hold some questions, we're going to go through our various, unless there's some urgent questions from task force members. I want to make sure we have 5 presenters today. We have, the riches of all these folks joining us, and I want to make sure we have a chance to hear from everybody. So if you want to kindly just put those questions in the chat and we will get to them a little later, if that's okay. We're going to go through the presentations and then circle back. So please note your questions either in the chat or in any pad you have next to you. Okay, all right, thank you so much. That was fascinating. A lot of food for thought. I think there are some differences in our laws, but we appreciate your insights and want to circle back on a number of the points you made. We're going to go next to Natalie Wagner. She's with the Connecticut Bar Foundation and is also working on a statewide initiative. So it'll be interesting to see the different contrasts, and I'm going to turn it over to Natalie now.
Great, thanks so much. Can you just confirm that you can hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you so much. And I just wanted to, I'll just quickly introduce myself again. Natalie Wagner, Executive Director of the Connecticut Bar Foundation. I'll tell you sort of our role in the process in a moment, but I also just wanted to give a quick shout out to everybody who's on this call who has generously volunteered your time to answer my questions. When we first became involved in this, all of you have been just so generous, and so I'm happy to be a part of this to help others that are coming down the line. So I just wanted to start with that. So we are not nearly as far. We do have a statute in place, which is great. That was it's Public Act 21-34 for anyone who wants to look up. I can provide later in our discussion a link to it so that you can you can look at the text of the statute. But so that was signed into law in June. And I'm not going to be able to answer all of your questions because we are still in the planning process. So I'm going to try and go through them, but then I'm going to also provide you just some general information about where we are at, because I think we are ahead of some, but obviously we're not nearly as far along as Jim is in Washington. So our law was passed in June, or it was signed into law in June, and it went into effect July 1st. Some of the reasons that we are not as far along is obviously it went into effect later than Jim's law, which went into effect in April. But in addition to that, we were not named as the administering entity in the law. So our judicial branch put out an RFP at the beginning of August, I think it was August 12th, to identify the administering entity. And then we were selected, I think the RFPs were due, the proposals were due at the beginning of September, and we were selected 2 weeks ago. So we did a lot anticipating that we were likely going to be the administering entity. We did a lot in the meantime anyway, without much authority, but we wanted to make sure that we could, you know, get a running start as soon as we were hopefully selected, which we were. So the Connecticut Bar Foundation, just so you have a sense, it is very different than OCLA. We are an independent standalone nonprofit organization that is the primary funder of legal aid in the state of Connecticut. And we have 3 primary funding sources for that, some of which you all are familiar with, IOLTA being one of them, which used to be the primary source of legal funding in Connecticut, but that has been largely superseded with court fee revenue, which is now our largest source of funding, as well as just a straight appropriation from the judicial branch. And then, so that's the space that we've typically occupied. So we typically are the primary source of operating funds for the legal aid providers throughout Connecticut. And so this is a somewhat different role for us because now we are funding a specific project with specific deliverables that are articulated in statute. So it is a new space that we're occupying. As will be the case for other, I think, bar foundations typically that might step into this space. And so we're having to staff up to do that. You know, we're going to hire a program director for this, as well as likely a grants administrator. And one of the reasons for that is not only were we lucky enough to get this project assigned to us, but we were also specifically named to administer a right to counsel, or an increased access to counsel is what I should call it. It's really more of a pilot for individuals who are applying for temporary restraining orders. So we're building up those 2 programs at the same time. But so getting back to this one in particular, the law that was passed does not provide for appointment of counsel, as is the case in Washington. What it does is it requires the judicial branch in Connecticut to put up a notice, which it was required to do on October 1st, of the new program. The thing that's somewhat unfortunate about that timing is that, of course, the program is not yet up and running, and notice is going out to tenants of the fact that there is this new program. It's just not yet available. So the timing has not been ideal for that. And I point that out, you know, because I want you all to sort of think through those things to the extent that you're still designing programs. And so what people encounter right now is we did get a hotline up and running, and we did get a website up really just to say the same thing, which is, you know, just so you know, this program is coming. And we are hoping to get it up and receiving clients in January. So that's our timing. You know, we were appointed in late September, and we're hoping to get the program up and running in January. Now, what our statute allows is somewhat similar to the Washington one in that it gives us time to phase it in. And I think we are likely going to do that because we are anticipating difficulty finding enough new attorneys in what is quite a small state to provide counsel to everyone in the state who's eligible for right to counsel under the program. And what that is in our statute is anyone at 80% of statewide median income who is at risk of eviction. So it's quite broad. And it also includes anyone who's at risk of housing subsidy termination. So it provides counsel both for individuals who are already in the eviction process and those who are likely to become part of the eviction process as a result of a loss of a housing subsidy. So again, it is quite broad. So what we're currently working off of to try and identify how to staff the program is largely eviction filings. So we are going to have to phase in because we might have to grow the program beyond that, noting that it also includes individuals who are losing subsidies or at risk of losing a subsidy. So one of the questions that you all asked us to respond to is who was involved in the development and implementation. So, you know, I'll talk about the development or the passage of it was actually really a grassroots effort. The Democratic Socialists of America were very much involved here in Connecticut in passage of the program. And then in the development and implementation side, we have a pretty large stakeholder group. I would say at the core of it is ourselves and our grantees, our largest grantees, also the judicial branch, some of the advocates involved. We have also a Connecticut Fair Housing Center who has access to a lot of data statewide, so they can help us in determining what the phasing criteria should be. We, similar to New York, are looking at a geographic phase-in. So based on the highest evicting zip codes is what we're looking at starting with at the moment. And which, you know, how far down that list of highest evicting zip codes will largely be determined by how many people we can hire hire and get trained between now and January. So that will be, you know, the primary thing that holds up statewide implementation is just getting people hired and trained. Thankfully, our largest programs have all been increasing the number of lawyers they have working on housing matters anyway, which they will be able to, in the beginning of the program, dedicate to the right to counsel effort. And that is because we, as Jim was mentioning in Washington, also have, as I'm sure a lot of you all have, significant emergency rental assistance that has been developed as in response to the COVID pandemic. So the state has identified $400 million that was awarded from the federal government as part of COVID relief for rental assistance, and our legal aid agencies, our largest legal aid providers, are all involved in helping with that effort as well. And then the funding that we've received for the Right to Counsel program is $20 million over 2 years. And just, to give some context for that dollar amount, I'll give you some of the stats of our filing rates so that you can compare it to the other programs. We have average eviction filings pre-COVID of about 21,000 filings a year, which is actually not so far off. Jim can talk to this a little more because I know that things work a little differently in Washington, but given the size of our state, is actually not so far off from the numbers of court filings anyway, from what I understand, in Washington state, and significantly below the number, obviously, in New York City. So, when you're looking at, how much you need and how to staff, I think, trying to figure out what is your demand is going to be really helpful in determining how much you're going to need. So we also have a statutorily appointed work group to advise on the implementation. And that's largely made up of individuals who do housing work from the legal aid providers. That's sort of the tenant side voice, but then also there's several landlord voices on there, as well as a low-income housing provider. And us as the administering entity and the judicial branch. And that is actually chaired by the commissioner of the Department of Housing in Connecticut. So we've met, they've actually met twice. I was officially a member of the council for the second meeting. And I think we'll be meeting largely on a monthly basis. I also wanted to talk a little bit about how we're selecting the agencies that will be actually administering the program. So what it says in our statute, it has 5 criteria for those organizations. They have to have a substantial experience in housing law and landlord-tenant law, and substantial experience furnishing free legal assistance to eligible individuals. Obviously, all of our current legal aid grantees fit that criteria. They also have to have a demonstrated history of serving the low-income community. So that is also going to apply to all of our current providers. And then specific things that they have to provide in order to become eligible under the Right to Counsel program is that they have to identify the geographic area in which they are going to provide the service. They have to have a plan to reach and provide the representation, especially to individuals with limited English proficiency, and they have to provide appropriate supervision and training. So those last 3 are really the things that we're asking them to specify, because we're going to do this for the first phase at least by invitation. We're inviting our largest legal aid providers as well as several others who have indicated that they're interested and eager to participate in the program to apply to become Right to Counsel providers. And then if we need additional attorneys, then we will invite others to apply as well. One of the things that we really still need to work through is who are going to take our conflict cases. And there's an extent to which we'll be able to, use some of our providers, to cover for each other. But largely our providers have either, our 3 largest providers really divide up the state. And so they don't go into each other's regions. There is one incubator program through one of our law schools that we have discussed taking conflict cases. And then some of our smaller providers that do operate on a statewide basis for select populations, we can also utilize, but that will only be the case for the populations that they serve, such as our veterans organization or individuals with mental health issues are served by another one of our smallest providers. So conflicts is going to be one that we're really working through, how to cover those individuals. One other thing I wanted to mention, just in response to the circumstance in Washington, is that we have a centralized judicial operations. So we're lucky in that we can really just deal with the judicial branch as opposed to having to, go to the different regions throughout the state in order to get judges to sort of buy into the program. We are largely working just with central court ops, which is a real benefit here in Connecticut. All right, I think I will leave it there and just allow others to ask questions to the extent you have them.
Okay, great. We do have a bunch of questions. One follow-up, if I may, is just how tenants are going to find their way to counsel. How will they access counsel?
Yeah, so as I stated before, we do have a statewide hotline for the program that exists at this point, but just tells people that the program, will be coming. And then we also have created a website, and both of those resources, both the hotline and the website, are available on the notice that the judicial branch was required to post. And that notice has to go out to tenants every time anything related to an eviction or a subsidy termination goes to them. So any notice that they receive from a landlord, in Connecticut, that's called a notice to quit. And then anything that they're getting from the court, the first thing they would be getting from a court in Connecticut is something called a notice of summary process eviction. And then anytime something in that case is scheduled, that notice about the program would also be attached to that.
Okay, great, thank you. Thanks, Natalie. That was interesting, and you are in the thick of it. So you're just ahead of us, but we have a longer lead time for implementation, although we're hoping to exceed those expectations. So we're going to turn next to New York, who enacted a right to counsel some time ago, who has had a little more experience or a little more time working with this program. And we are pleased to have Jordan Dressler with us to talk about their program. Thank you.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay? Yes? Great.
Yes.
I'll apologize. Thank you. I'll apologize in advance for my voice. I'm feeling a little under the weather, but I will try to keep my voice up. My name's Jordan Dressler. I'm the Civil Justice Coordinator, excuse me, here in New York City. Oversee the city's Office of Civil Justice. Can you hear me okay? Yes?
Yeah, you're coming through just fine.
Yeah, sorry about that. Excuse me. And we oversee the implementation of the city's right to counsel. The law was enacted in 2017. It's Local Law 136, New York City Local Law 136, excuse me, of 2017. And simply put, the law says that all tenants in eviction proceedings will receive access to free legal services. That's full legal representation for those, excuse me, at 200% of the federal poverty guidelines or less, and for those making more, brief legal assistance. But I do want to say, certainly since the pandemic and even prior to the pandemic, plenty of our partner legal services organizations are providing full legal representation to those making more with more moderate incomes pursuant to a waiver coming from my office, and our contracts with those providers permit that. I'm going to apologize. I have a feeling I'm going to lose my voice before this is done, which I'll just apologize for. The law imposes the mandate on my office to provide the services. As Jim pointed out, the law does not mandate the court, which is a state court, creature of state law, to appoint counsel, ensure that counsel has been appointed. So with that, we have often referred to it as an access to counsel law. However, right to counsel, the importance that services are widely available in all cases is very important. And we do refer to it as our city's right to counsel law, and we refer to it as RTC services. The law also mandates my office to issue annual progress reports with specified data points about the impact of services and the breadth of services, and hold an annual public hearing to hear feedback on implementation and take lessons learned. In our current fiscal year, city funding for tenant legal services, which includes right to counsel and housing court, totals $166 million. By comparison, funding was at $6 million in 2013. But with a new mayoral administration at the time, a new leadership in my agency, the city's Department of Social Services, there was a recognition that civil legal services, and in particular tenant legal services, were a critical component of our work to address poverty and income inequality and make the city just a fair place to live and work. And that one of the ways to do that was addressing the imbalance in housing court, where at the time only 1% of tenants had lawyers if they were facing eviction proceedings, compared to well over 90% of landlords. So investments were made and progress started in earnest in 2015. My office, OCJ, was established in 2015. Similar to Jim's office in the state of Washington, we were the city's first dedicated office to launching and overseeing civil legal services programs with the ability to make policy and then also implement those policies through contracts. I will say having a dedicated office to the implementation of a program of this magnitude is critical. This can't be a side project for any agency. Prior to the establishment of OCJ, civil legal services programs and even tenant legal services programs were all over the place in various city agencies, contracts here and contracts there. But the programs were consolidated and new contracts were initiated through an RFP process in 2015. Although we did not know that we would be implementing a right to counsel, we did know that we would be increasing access to legal services for tenants in eviction proceedings. And those contracts, and the renewals of those contracts and the amendments of those contracts are the contracts that are supporting our right to counsel program today. We also had a reporting requirement as an Office of Civil Justice to provide annual reports. And in our very first report, we wanted to hit the ground running on this question. So we tackled the questions of what is the gap in representation for tenants facing eviction We knew that it was 99% in 2013. Where did it stand in 2015 after we had already started making investments and increasing access to legal assistance? What does income look like for tenants in housing court eviction proceedings? And what would full implementation mean in terms of low-income tenants facing eviction? So we tackled those questions through a combination of a review of court filings, surveys of the tenant populace in housing court, actually literally standing in housing court and doing anonymous surveys of what income was to get a sense of what income distribution looked like, so we had a sense of what this would take. We had also forged relationships, contractual and otherwise, with a range of legal services providers across New York City. We have been very lucky in a lot of ways in having a robust network of legal services organizations across New York City that predated the creation of my office, that we have been very proud to support and grow. And also very lucky, as Natalie alluded to have a centralized housing court with a supervising judge of housing court, supervising judges of each borough, so that we really had one place to go. That being said, judges are judges, and presiding judges in particular courtrooms have their own views, their own experiences, and their own rules of the court. And so, again, in the spirit of lessons learned, having a coordinating entity that can work with court administrators and even troubleshoot with individual presiding judges, and there are 50 of them in New York City handling housing court matters, goes a long way in ensuring a good implementation of a program. So I just want to focus on some of the lessons we have learned through implementation, some of the impacts that we've seen, and then I'm happy to answer questions, great and small, on how implementation has gone. Some of what we learned is that this would take time. This would take years. Just getting started with the program, we knew that we could not flip a switch and have capacity available, trained, experienced capacity available on the legal services side to meet all needs. So we needed a sensible way to phase in programming over years, and also a way to explain that to the world at large in a way that ensured that we were making promises that we knew we could keep, because we knew that confidence in the system would go a long way in furthering our goal to getting full implementation. And we did not want to see any setbacks early on of more supply than demand or more demand than supply. We knew after some early experience that we needed to reduce the barriers to entry by putting access to legal services in court. An early version of our programming involved a notice, just a flyer, at the clerk's office in housing courts where tenants would submit their answers to non-payment proceedings, required part of the civil procedure. The clerks did a great job of handing out the notices. People looked at the notices and had to move on with their day. And what we realized was that anybody in a housing court proceeding is in some level of crisis. And anyone in that kind of crisis is not going to be inclined to take time out of their day in that moment of filing the answer, particularly when they don't know that legal services might be available to them, to then take what might be another hour or even two to sit down with a legal services organization in that moment to conduct the required intake interview to allow the provider to take on the case. By the same token, if we had legal services in court and the understanding that a quick intake could take place in court, where the tenant appearing in court already knows they're in for some substantial part of their day being dedicated to this, there was a less barrier to entry, fewer sort of off ramps for folks to go. and we saw a much higher take-up rate as a result. In order to do that, we needed to work closely with the courts to identify courtrooms and then interview space. These are courthouses not designed for this kind of operation. This had been a primarily pro se court for tenants for decades, and retrofitting operations in order to allow for meaningful, dignified communications between attorneys and either their potential clients or their actual clients took a lot of work, a lot of coaxing, and a lot of coordination among all parties. We also knew that even just in a particular borough, given the size of the caseload, the size of the courthouses, that we needed to concentrate presumptively eligible cases in order to maximize efficiency. And again, needed to do that in a way that targeted services where they were most needed and allow for us to communicate availability and eligibility in a way that was sensible and actually address needs. And so maybe it goes without saying, but we needed a very, very close partnership with the courts to make this work. And again, the courts are a creature of state law, state agency, I suppose, not just on logistics, but we also realized early on that having the judicial imprimatur of for the program, that this was something that tenants could do, implying that this was something that tenants should do, meaning take advantage of available legal services, went a long way to increasing take-up and ensuring that all parties knew this was part of operations in housing courts starting in 2017. So I'm just going to go through some of the questions that you had. We had a very broad stakeholder group that we work with, primarily informally, though again, we do have annual public hearings in order to get more formal feedback. Not just my office and other entities in city government, but the judiciary and court administrators, our network of legal providers, law schools and bar associations, and importantly, a very broad coalition of very zealous tenant advocates who I'm very grateful for, not just for pushing the law and the program past the goal line to requirement and implementation, but also keeping us honest in terms of how we are implementing. I say that we are at full implementation, but implementation itself is a full-time job, and we are constantly making adjustments, large and small, to ensure that services are being made available appropriately. How and at what point do eligible tenants get connected to counsel? We have multiple points. Again, I've focused primarily on making services available in court at the first appearance because life being what it is, many tenants aren't going to take advantage and opt in prior to that point, but some do. And for them, we have a hotline that's set up. We have information on our website about how to access legal services. And we have a fairly complicated at this point rotation schedule with our network of legal providers who are contracted with us to ensure that if a call comes in and a case is on a particular day, this was a case that that the provider would have picked up in court anyway, and we are able to use that rotation as essentially a scheduling tool and a referral assignment tool to coordinate amongst the providers on who's getting what and when. That information is not just available on our website, but information about the availability of legal services under the law, excuse me, is on every court notice, a notice of eviction petition. It is on a notice of New York City Housing Authority, our public housing authority, notice of administrative termination of tenancy proceedings, which is also covered under our right to counsel law. And in the coming year, we're on track to launch partnerships with community-based organizations across the city who are on the ground doing the outreach and organizing work in order to increase awareness of the right to counsel and then make referrals to providers as needed. In terms of the data that we're collecting, I will put in the chat, again, if I can figure it out, our website where you can find our progress reports. That will give you, I think, a picture of the kinds of data we're collecting from providers. We're collecting it on a case level basis with identifying information. We have worked out protocols to ensure privacy, to ensure the attorney-client relationship and attorney-client confidentiality, and also to be sensitive to issues such as immigration status. Immigration status is not an eligibility criteria in any way for our services, but collecting information is always a fraught exercise. In terms of how we are measuring ourselves, I just wanted to point out we are measuring in the following ways. In New York City, evictions, and this is all prior to COVID, obviously COVID really throws the numbers off. Evictions were down 40% since 2013, between 2013 and 2019. Eviction filings are down over 30%. In terms of the representation rate for tenants in eviction proceedings in housing court in New York City, like I said, in 2013, that was 1%. As of the end of the first half of fiscal year 2020, that rate was close to 40%. And maybe most importantly, we are measuring how lawyers do in their cases. This can be a challenging exercise given how eviction proceedings proceed. There's a tremendous amount of back and forth. But at the end of the day, we are concerned about whether the outcome in a case handled by one of the attorneys funded under our programs got an outcome that allowed that tenant to stay or required them to go from their residence. And I'm happy to say that in 84% of cases with full legal representation, they end with an outcome that allows that tenant to remain in the home. Next question here is, has there been a need for any changes to the program since initial implementation? I wrote myself one word here, and that is COVID. COVID has upended housing court operations in a way that I think ultimately will be positive for all involved. First and foremost, it has required a shift to virtual appearances and virtual proceedings in many ways, which has, for better or for worse, unlocked the ability to become more efficient in many ways. There was a tremendous amount of churn, tremendous amount of waiting involved in housing court for everyone involved. And we're starting to see some fundamental changes in court operations, in litigant experience, in certainly the experience of legal services providers with the changes in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic. I would never say this is a good thing by any means, but we are trying to make the most of the necessary changes that we're seeing in the legal system. Let me pause there. I'm really happy to take all your calls, and I also want to just shout out my fellow administrators here. We, I think, have done a great job of staying in touch with each other. We've all been very generous with each other on time and experience, and I think I speak for all of us when I say we're very, very pleased to do this today and happy to continue to do this for the state of Maryland.
Thanks so much, Jordan. I really appreciate it. We are going to move on with presentations. I know there's a lot of questions in the chat, and we want to leave plenty of time to be able to talk about those. And I think there'll be some lively exchanges between the different administrators and jurisdictions in doing that. We wanted to look next at San Francisco, and Ryan Murphy from the Eviction Defense Collaborative is here with us to talk a little bit about how they've approached right to counsel in eviction cases. Ryan?
Hi, everyone. So first of all, this has been pretty illuminating to hear about some of the other programs. So I'm very happy to be here and hopefully can contribute as well. So quick introduction about me and my organization. My name's Ryan Murphy. I'm the Deputy Director of Litigation and Policy at the Eviction Defense Collaborative in San Francisco. The Eviction Defense Collaborative is kind of the lead agency that's actually providing the legal services to do the work in court. And that's the bulk of my job, is to actually litigate the cases, primarily working with the attorneys to see those cases go through court, which is from, you know, the initial filing all the way through trial, potentially. Our Right to Counsel program has been in place since July 1, 2019. Voters in the city of San Francisco approved Right to Counsel, which sometimes it was Proposition F, so sometimes we call it Prop F, TRC. They're all same names that are getting tossed around. But anyways, yeah, that was passed in 2018, started in July 1, 2019. The law that was passed basically entitles every tenant facing eviction the right to an attorney. So the only exceptions to that are in master tenant for subtenant situations, which is actually fairly common in San Francisco, and in a situation where the owner lives with the tenant. Importantly, there's no income caps on that. So we have actually had a couple of cases with pretty high income tenants, but it certainly is, you know, very rare to see that. As far as how it's funded, the ordinance requires the city to fund the program, but it lacks specificity. So it's up to the Board of Supervisors and the mayor as part of the city funding process, or the budget process, excuse me, to determine that funding. And it doesn't designate a funding source. So there's a lot of, that's been one constant since the program's been started, is yeah, having to advocate and figure out that funding for the program as it's been going on. As far as how the program was started and implemented, certainly, like some of the other presenters mentioned, tenant advocacy groups were instrumental in getting the law passed and helping us getting off the ground. I'm not sure we could have done any of this without them. But basically, we built the system on top of the existing eviction defense system that existed in San Francisco, which already did, you know, had some organization to it, where basically there's 9 to 10 legal aid organizations that are providing eviction defense work prior to Prop F. And so what we did in San Francisco is basically built the Right to Counsel system on top of that existing system. So prior to Prop F, our office was pretty much the central point of first contact for tenants that were facing eviction. If tenants went to different legal aid organizations, the idea was to always route them to us because we have a legal clinic, and we would do the first response to ensure that tenants don't default and automatically lose their case. And then we would refer them out to other legal aid organizations that kind of more better suited to address the particular tenant that would come in. So, for example, we have legal organizations that, you know, specifically for seniors or persons with mental health disabilities or HIV. So we send, basically we were a hub before, so the tenants would come to our office as one central spot, and then they would get referred out. And essentially that's how the program still operates now with Right to Counsel. And some of the reasoning behind that is because we think it's easier for tenants to get access that way. It's much less confusing, certainly, to be directed to only one spot. Yeah, and then as far as once so basically a tenant comes into our office, we do the initial intake. Still haven't figured out my Apple Watch, sorry. They come into our office, and then we do an intake, and we take down certain data to determine if that person can be referred to another legal services organization. That's how we kind of share the load between the system. And we have an algorithm, and that's sort of helps us steer people in the right direction. When we implemented the program, we had to negotiate with the city as to how many cases per year an attorney would be required to do. The number that we landed on was 50. So there's roughly 50 attorneys supposed to be in the system at any given time, and those attorneys, according to the funding, are supposed to do about 50 cases per year, which is quite a bit because that's one per week on average. as the program has gone on, we have continued to work in collaboration with the court. In San Francisco, we only have, it's a city and county, we only have one housing court. We have state court, and then there's one specific department that handles all housing matters. So that makes it a little bit easier in terms of just hearing about New York. I mean, that sounds so much more challenging with so many different judges. But for us, we now have regular meetings with the court to assess issues that come up. And that's ongoing on a monthly basis, and the landlord bar is present for those meetings as well. So as I mentioned before, as far as how eligible tenants get to connected to counsel is the vast majority of tenants facing eviction are routed to our office, is my understanding. When a case is filed, the court will send out a notice to the tenant even before the tenant has been served. It'll be mailed to their address, and that will include our contact information. So tenant knows to visit our office first. And like I said before, sort of all the organizations, and if somebody goes and speaks to a court clerk, they're going to route them to our office, basically. It is possible if a tenant, for example, if they qualify for a different organization, they could go directly to that organization, but that's not as common. So let's see. The data that we use to collect, we collect quite a bit of data. We do it at the initial intake, basic contact information, race, ethnicity, income, and certainly that's for funding purposes, but also to know where to route them as far as other organizations that can best serve them. So, like I said, we're doing that assessment at the initial intake, and then as a hub, then sending them out to other organizations to actually perform the full scope legal representation. We also have a rubric to track case outcomes. It's fairly detailed as far as what can happen in a given case. Certainly, the primary criteria is whether or not the tenant gets to stay or if they have to move, and whether or not if a move is, for lack of a better word, like a good move out deal or a bad move out deal, as far as like, if any money was exchanged or if the tenant got time or free rent. We are keeping track of those numbers. And as I said before, all tenants are eligible in our system. There is no income limit. Other organizations do have those specific limits. I mean, Legal Services Corporation, we have a couple of those in our city. And they, we try to not steer the tenant there in the first place if we can obtain that information at the outset. But ultimately, they're the ones that have to do their intake. And of course, LSC has, strict immigration status and income requirements compared to some of our other organizations like us, for example, who don't have either of those and can represent anybody regardless of immigration status or income. Someone else mentioned what changes have taken place since the program's been implemented. I mean, it's COVID. That has been certainly the biggest change by far. It radically changed how we do intake. Before, we required that every single person, in order to do an intake, they would have to come into our office. Now, for safety reasons, obviously, we try to do the intake remote whenever possible. I'm surprised how well we've coped with that, to be honest, because many of our clients do not have phones or reliable means of communication. So the fact that we've been able to get that to work still and still meet clients where they're at and make sure they get legal access, we have been able to pivot and do that. The system, as it was initially created, like I said at the start, didn't have a specific funding source, or it's just that it had to be funded, no more specifics than that. So that's a continued aspect of advocacy from the legal services org is to advocate for more funding, because the system has been able to handle most of the cases since COVID, because there's been a drastic reduction specifically in non-payment cases. But now with that coming to an end, we're anticipating that there will be some gaps, and there will be some unrepresented tenants like there were before the pandemic struck. And so to compensate for that, we have we're working on like a limited scope representation model. So basically, even if you don't get a full scope, even if the tenant does not get a full scope attorney, they'll still touch a lawyer at some point to assist them, primarily with the mandatory settlement conference, which is required before the tenant gets sent to trial. We're in the process of trying to adjust our, we basically had a first come, first served model. So if you were, basically, as long as you got to our office, you know, if you're lucky enough to get there first, then you'd be that was the priority for assigning attorneys, basically. And that has a lot of equity and fairness issues attached to it. And so we're working on trying to adjust that, but it's a complicated process, and we're still working on tinkering with that. Like I said, there's no income limits in San Francisco. So just for example, we were talking about, it's like, well, what if we, you know, attach some income limit to it? Maybe that would help, you know, better allocate where the resources are going. But, you know, rich people don't get evicted as much. So even cutting those numbers doesn't have like a drastic impact. So we're still working on trying to find a more fair, equitable system. We quickly realized with this work, I mean, we always knew it was going to be a high volume of casework for our attorneys. I think it has had a positive impact in that we've always, at our office, we've always, you know, embraced the like holistic approach to solving an eviction case, because eviction obviously is, you know, often a symptom of something else. Or some other issue going on with the family or the tenant. So we've taken additional steps as time's gone on to add support services to our attorneys. So specifically, the legal aid organizations here didn't have a lot of paralegals initially. We're upping that to try to do, you know, some of the work the paralegals can do to offset that load, and also implementing social work into our organization and other organizations in San Francisco has been hugely important, because particularly the lawyer can only do so much. I mean, the lawyer can deal with the legal, you know, they have the legal expertise to advise on the settlement agreement that the tenant gets. So once they sign that settlement agreement, which often has the tenant, you know, doing things that honestly are difficult for somebody to do on their own, in order to maintain their housing, adding that social work component, it's really helped, and I'm optimistic that's going to, you know, improve our housing retention numbers, and certainly, you know, access to other services. I mean, I'm sure many of us have heard, you know, people can't pay their rent because they don't get their unemployment, because their unemployment was wrongly taken away, and you know, helping with sort of related matters, but not directly related to the housing has been huge.
Great. No, that's terrific. Was there any? I'm gonna move us along, Ryan, unless you have, because we're getting an enormous amount of questions.
Oh,
and
I
so,
was just,
yeah, if you want to kind of give us your kind of final, and I'm going to go to John, and so we can make sure we address the questions that keep popping up.
Sure. I was just going to say, I mean, it's hard to I've done this work since before the Tenant Right to Counsel was passed, and it's hard to overstate the impact that having a lawyer on the process. I mean, there's our numbers of housing retention have basically doubled since before. So it's yeah, it's exciting to hear that other, you know, places in the country are doing the same thing. So thank you. Thank
you so much, Ryan. I really appreciate it. And it's just, as I said, we have an embarrassment of riches of so many people here with great experiences to share. We wanted to turn now to John Pollack, who leads the National Coalition for a Civil Right to Counsel, as kind of a summary to talk, as you know, John, we've heard from James Bamberger, Natalie Wagner, Jordan Dressler, and Ryan Murphy, and have had a chance to see how the right to counsel has been implemented in a number of jurisdictions. But we'd love some kind of summary comments from you about the right to counsel, where it stands, some other, whatever information you can provide to Maryland as we try and stand up the program. And then after yours, we'll move to those questions.
Thank you. And it's a pleasure to be here, and it's a pleasure to be talking about this issue and having had Maryland join the ranks of the now 14 jurisdictions with the right to counsel for tenants facing eviction. We were really pleased to have Toledo and Louisville join the ranks in the last couple of months. You've had a lot of the experts here to talk about, the impact it's had. New York, the three jurisdictions, New York, San Francisco, and Cleveland, that have been able to report results have had stunning results. Really, is the only way to describe it. When you have 2/3 or more of tenants remaining in their homes, or in Cleveland's case, 93% avoiding either an eviction or an involuntary move, the right to counsel is doing everything that we've always known it would do based on decades of studies that showed the impact of providing counsel. So now we're getting the live evidence that's showing that when you provide it systemically as a matter of right, that doesn't change. It really, I think one of the things that that's really been so helpful from the right to counsel data is, a perception that, there are only certain cases where an attorney is going to make a difference, which is an argument we've been fighting for a long time. And the data that's coming out really shows that's not true. It systemically changes results. And I think I don't know if this was mentioned by Jordan, but when you look at the drop in the filing rate in New York City, and San Francisco has had a smaller but similar drop, it really shows that it changes the whole way the system works. You have landlords who are thinking, this is not always a case of landlords who are acting in bad faith. The drop in filing can just simply be that, rather than simply immediately resorting to an eviction, they may think, well, is this something I can work out with the tenant, because it might be cheaper to do that now that there's going to be a lawyer than it would be to just go to court, where in Maryland it's $15 filing fee is basically no obstacle at all. It's cheaper than a parking ticket, to basically evict someone, which is a whole other problem in and of itself that needs to be addressed. But as far as what we've seen on the ground, we have, of the 14 jurisdictions, there are a few others that are getting closer to the implementation stage. Philadelphia just provided $3 million of general revenue into its new right to counsel. Boulders has now been off the ground for, I think, 6 months. The city contracted with a legal aid program there. The cities that have passed it more recently, the places like Denver and Toledo and Louisville and Seattle are still kind of earlier in the process of we're waiting to see how this is going to be done. One thing I think that's really important from Maryland's perspective is where there has been a difficulty in securing the general revenue, there's been no hesitation in using the emergency rental assistance and fiscal recovery funds to fund it. And while we're not usually people who would encourage a reliance on a temporary source of funding for a right to counsel like that, where the funding is as significant as can be provided by those sources, and where it can be multi-year, and given that we're still really in a pandemic and facing, a very, very perilous situation with the end of the moratorium and the delays in rental assistance, we're still of the opinion that those funding sources need to be looked at seriously, and the commitments need to be made. It's also worth noting, for Maryland's sake, that this past Monday, Treasury released its guidance on what's going to happen with jurisdictions that have not spent their emergency rental assistance funds, and basically has told them it's going to start taking them away, which we've known for some time. I actually don't know what Maryland's consumption rate is, but any jurisdiction that hasn't hit the 30% threshold is going to start losing funding. We're below that. So basically the Treasury has basically made it clear they're going to start taking that money away. When jurisdictions commit ERAP funds for legal aid, that housing stability funding actually will help Maryland meet that threshold. which is one of the things we've been trying to emphasize to jurisdictions. This is not just a good idea in terms of helping tenants, it will also prevent you from losing funding you would otherwise have. So, and that message has been carrying weight. If you look at our website, you'll see on civilrightstocounsel.org, we track all the jurisdictions that have made either emergency rental assistance or fiscal recovery fund commitments, and there are dozens of them that have made it. You know, anywhere from a few $100,000 to many millions of dollars have been committed. Some of the commitments, like, you know, in California, where they've committed 120 million, obviously very significant commitment there, but Texas committed 20 million. The state of Missouri just committed $1 million into its pot for it. I mean, this is a very doable solution, and really, in light of the failure of the funding increase bill last year, is just an imperative for Maryland to act quickly. I'm sure it was discussed, you know, that a right to counsel can't just be implemented instantaneously, even when the funding is there. You need time to hire and train, and so, you know, the time is really now for the state to act on making that commitment. I'm guessing I'm preaching to the converted with this, but it's just worth saying nonetheless. You know, with regards to other things that have come up, I'm happy to answer questions about, you know, implementation issues that people have run into in these jurisdictions. There are a lot of different ways we could talk about that. But I think, you know, the thing that's most encouraging to us, besides the number of cities and states that have passed it, is that even places that we normally not hear speak on right to counsel, like the White House. You know, the White House in its most recent, some of its most recent releases has started to use right to counsel, encouraging jurisdictions to pass right to counsel. That's a real change, even from a blue administration to hear that kind of language. We didn't hear that from the Obama administration, you know, them explicitly calling for that. And in this case, they're calling for jurisdictions to use their emergency rental assistance funds for that purpose. But supporting the concept in general, hearing it from the White House, hearing the call for, you know, legal services from the National Center for State Courts, hearing it from the Federal Reserve, where we've been working with them. They're actually really committed. Many of the offices are committed to this idea. The United Way and other places, the Salvation Army. We're just, you know, there's really broad support for this right now. So I'll stop there. I'm happy to answer questions. There's obviously a lot of specifics I could get into, but I just wanted to give a thumbnail sketch of where things are right now. I will mention one last thing, which is that in 2021, there were actually 10 states that introduced a right to counsel bill, which Maryland was one. 3 of them passed. All 3, I think, were first-time bills: Connecticut, Maryland, and Washington State. We expect there to be at least 3 or 4 states that are reintroducing in 2022. So Maryland should have some more company pretty soon.
Thank you, John. That's great. It's encouraging to see, you know, we're part of this movement, and we're excited to see how we can implement in Maryland. We have a lot of questions, kind of aggregated them. I know some have been answered in the chat. I'm going to begin just peppering with the questions from the chat. If some of my colleagues on the task force want to do follow-up, you could unmute and do that. I thought I'd just start to tick through what we have so far for our speakers. And John, feel free to weigh in as well if you could give us some other examples. Jim Bamberger, one of the first questions was in the implementation report published in July, it states that Northwest Legal Aid assumed the role of the entry or screener for entrance into the program process. What were the factors that led to that decision, and did they have the infrastructure, or was it phased in? Jim, I don't know if we lost Jim there. Okay. Are you with us, Jim? If not, I may come back to him for that question, and because we have a lot. All right. This one for Jordan. To what extent does the New York system rely on technology to do intakes and screening?
Thank you for the question. It depends, excuse me, on sort of what stage we're talking about. To the extent that our partner handling hotline work, or the fellow city agency who's also sharing in the hotline work is taking calls and tracking calls. There's, case management software that's being used there. To the extent that those calls or those inquiries are coming to us at OCJ for referral out to a legal provider, we have an in-house system that we designed that not only tracks these referrals, but also matches up with court data that we receive to both validate the cases and so that we've got additional insight into the procedural posture, the history, and even the history of representation in many cases that we can report related back to a particular provider or a particular lawyer and send the case back. Some people tend to forget who their lawyer is in some cases, and so we need a mechanism in order to do that. And the providers themselves, as I mentioned in the chat, are using a range of case management systems on their own and their own tracking and scheduling softwares. It all sort of adds up to reporting that is fairly straightforward. We're talking about big Excel sheets in CSV format, according to agreed upon data protocols with each element that we need and coded as such. That we're receiving via a secure FTP site. We're then ingesting that data, putting it into our database so that we can do the kind of analysis, both for performance and efficiency that we need to do.
Thanks so much, Jordan. I noticed also Ryan had answered the question that they're using Salesforce Justice Server for referrals. So their system is largely automated, right, Ryan? That's accurate. I think we're looking at how to, implement. Thank you. Okay, and Jim is back. He got kicked off. Welcome back, Jim.
Well, thank you. I'm so sorry about that.
Yeah, and the question for you, it might have been from Stu Sims, was about the Northwest Legal Aid assumed the role of the screener, and what?
Right. I think I saw 3 questions in that one post, so I'll try to answer them. So the Northwest Justice Project has for years operated the central hotline for civil legal aid and has over those terms of years developed and expanded the technology capability to be effective and efficient in doing so. They have a system where they have dedicated staff, non-lawyer staff, who actually play a screening role, and then they assign cases to either in-house attorneys or to attorneys in cooperating programs. It was actually a very easy call for us to identify them and to charge them with developing the screening function. We wanted a single point of contact where courts could refer tenants who appear unrepresented for screening and then for assignment to the appropriate participating RTC contractor. And we funded them to hire 20 dedicated full-time screeners. Their main hotline only has 10, so we have really beefed that up. And they were able to set that up very quickly with a dedicated number. And we also have the online portal for applications as well for screening. Our screening system is very simple. There are 2 questions to be asked. Do you meet the, have you received a summons for unlawful detainer? That's step 1. And 2, do you meet the income eligibility requirements, which are very simple, either 200% or below of the federal poverty guideline, or you are automatically eligible if you're a recipient of one of a multiple number of dedicated needs-based assistance programs. I thought it might be useful to share with you, because a number of questions have come up about like, how are you allocating, how have you funded, et cetera, et cetera. So I'd like to just briefly share with you So you can see, and if people want it, this is today's version, I believe, if I can find it. Let me find the window. Yeah, this is today's version of our running budget obligations. So you can see that we have all of the providers with which we have contracted here. We have the number of dollars that we have obligated just for the contractors, number of attorneys, and then the infrastructure, which is the program manager, program counsel. We're going to have a dedicated language access and ADA coordinator. We're going to add support staff. And then we have a contract and dedicated $100,000 for interpreters, or $200,000 for interpreters statewide, $100,000 for research, and we are undertaking a very comprehensive outreach and media program. We're using not only the appropriated funds, but we're also using CRF funding that's been made available. We think it's going to cost somewhere between $200,000 and $250,000 to do this right, to reach all of the hard-to-serve tenants who do not trust the legal aid system, who do not trust the law and justice system, who do not know what their rights are, and we are just really, really committed to doing that. As I said in the chat, okay, let me go back to you guys. As I said in the chat, we use Legal Server as the mechanism. Okay, Mr. Sims' other question was, what factors led to the decision? Okay, I think I've answered that. Did the program assign fees for training? Yes, we have dedicated a substantial amount of our appropriation for training and for ongoing support. We have done a lot of in-house training. As I say, we've done 15 hours of mandatory training. We've recorded all of that. Every lawyer must take that training and must submit to us a certification that they have completed the training. And that includes not only the in-house staff attorneys, but also it includes contract attorneys who have been engaged under authority of our contracting to handle conflicts or to otherwise provide RTC services. As it relates to the University of Washington, it's a long story. I'll try and make it short. 3 years ago, the legislature funded a study, a comparative study of the effectiveness of appointed counsel versus baseline. Then we initiated the study. We hired this particular team of researchers who've done a lot of work in the area of law and justice and court systems. We got the study going, and then COVID hit and the moratorium came in and we suspended the study. So they were real easy because we could build on the work that they had done in advance of the study.
Thank you. And I see Natalie had her hand up to add a comment.
Yeah, thank you so much. So before we move down from intake, I just wanted to make note of something that we're struggling with right now in funding allocation and also just process with regard to intake. And I thought maybe we could just get a little bit more from the other programs that have already started administration about this, which is when we're moving from a model of scarcity, right, where the number of people that are calling far exceeds the number that can be served. We have an intake process that involves not only an eligibility determination, but also a first touch so that you can get people short advice before you pass them along in case you lose them or they ultimately, do not get an attorney. And some of that has already been mentioned in terms of just making sure that they respond, right? So that they're not losing their rights by not responding to a court notice. And so the reason I'm making this point is because in terms of funding allocation for this program, we're trying to figure out, do we need to staff intake and referral in the same way, or can we just do a shorter intake and pass people off right away to a program that's going to provide full representation? And I'm just curious if those who already have programs that are being administered could just touch on that quickly.
And I'll just say very briefly, Natalie, that is our model. Our model is quick touch, less than 2 working day turnaround, and it gets to the right program. And then the attorney with that program makes an appearance and requests appointment, and the court enters an order appointing. And in the context of doing so, automatically continues the case for at least a week.
Jordan or Ryan?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I think, again, the main focus of our program, at least lately, has been in-court connection. And so it's all happening at once. The meeting with the provider, the assignment of counsel, and the beginning of the relationship. Not much is happening in terms of investigation by the attorney or the legal provider in that first meeting, but there's an understanding by all involved that the case is going to be put over for a short time, and at the next appearance, everyone will be knowledgeable, and it may well be resolved in that next appearance. I think one thing to note, and I think gets to one of the questions that came up in the chat, is that was par for the course in many cases anyway, even if there was an understanding that, meaning prior to the right to counsel, even if there was an understanding between landlord's counsel and an unrepresented tenant, we're going to work this out, and we just have to find what the right number in terms of non-payment and making good on the rental arrears is. A number of steps involved to get that, particularly in the large number of cases that involve some level of government assistance in order to make good on that rental arrears. One of the things that has changed with the right to counsel is how that process works in many cases. You can imagine how much more efficiently an application for rental assistance, whether it is city-funded or state-funded rental assistance, or now with federally funded emergency rental assistance program funding, might go with the assistance of a legal services provider versus a pro se tenant who might be just sort of struggling to hold it all together. So landlord's counsel, by and large, has been supportive of the right to counsel because it is a tool for efficiency. To get to case outcomes that much quicker. Navigating the bureaucracies involved in getting access to rental assistance. So there you have it.
I'll just add really quick. When people come to our office, we basically assess the urgency in terms of like how close they are to the end of the process. So if somebody comes in and they already have the eviction judgment against them because they missed, whatever deadline, then certainly that gets high priority. If an eviction case has been filed, we ensure that nobody defaults in the case. And then if they come in with an eviction notice, even though ideally we would represent them for capacity issues, we don't at that stage. We basically tell them to wait until they get the eviction lawsuit, because that's, just to keep our system a little more grease in the wheels. And then if they're pre-notice, they get referred to one of our local tenant advocacy counseling agencies, basically. So that's how we generally do the intake.
And as for staffing, I know, Ryan, you answered, I think it was Sharice's question about social workers, and that that you are partnering with, or you have social workers on staff to help as well. Is that right?
Yeah, that's a very recent development. That's within the last year, and it's had a great impact. I mean, certainly for our legal aid attorneys are often tasked with having to do a lot more than just legal work. So, having to share that with somebody, particularly people with better expertise with how to deal with, mental health crises and things. Can't say enough good things about it. Hopefully we can get more social work.
I would add
any other providers? Yeah.
I was just going to add, this is John. I would just add a plug for that as well. Social workers or community-based organizers working with attorneys, not just division of labor, but also community trust levels. Like a lot of the people who've been already working in the community, take-up rate. I don't know if take-up rate has become an issue, has been discussed on this call, but in some of the programs, there's been an issue with people refusing the service even when it's offered to them. And there are a lot of reasons why that happens, but some of that can be distrust. And building those trust relationships often can require people who are already embedded in the community. So I just wanted to put in a plug for that.
Thank you. Okay, and there's a number of questions about outcomes and tracking outcomes and studies. There's one specific for you, Jordan, about the outcome you mentioned, the 84% success metric for cases with right to counsel, and it's is there any publicly available data available for review around that metric? And the person would be interested to see the case type breakdown as well as the case duration and specific outcomes if available. So
yeah, our data reporting is up on our website. I put it into the chat. We have not looked at distinguishing between different kinds of cases and determining those outcomes. We know that in cases where money is an issue, lawyers are successful, I should say, in helping tenants take advantage of available assistance programs. And in cases where money is not an issue, even in those cases where the outcome is that somebody is going to have to leave the residence, lawyers can often be successful in working out a more reasonable time frame for that, to allow for a softer landing, keeping folks out of homeless shelters, et cetera. So, yeah.
Great. And how about just generally tracking outcomes and, setting that up at the beginning and studies? I know we heard from you, Jim, that you've begun that work in partnership. Are others doing those same types of things as they set up the program to assess effectiveness?
We set up criteria at the outset of the program as far as, so we have like a pretty detailed rubric. I don't know if there's like 10, 15 options that get tracked. Yeah.
Okay, and then another question about timing. Have any jurisdictions reviewed if the average time between filing and resolution has changed after the implementation of a right to counsel? That's for all of you. I think we've touched on that. If anybody has any other insights about that, or John.
So the question is whether or not it's a lengthened case time, essentially having a right to counsel.
Right. Has that changed the average time between filing and resolution?
I haven't seen, I don't know what was discussed prior to my joining, but there was actually a study done in Massachusetts a number of years ago that looked at this explicit question and found that actually the amount of judicial involvement in the case decreased when counsel was present. The case may have stayed open for more numbers of days, but that was irrelevant because the court wasn't actually doing anything with the case. But as far as the number of times the judge had to hear the case or review the case file, it actually went down when the tenants had representation.
And this is Jim, and I'll just add, in Washington, the implementation accompanies substantial changes in substantive landlord-tenant eviction law. In our state, there was a separate bill, House Bill 1236, that established a limited just cause. We've always been a no-cause state. We now have a limited just cause eviction program or law. We fully anticipate that the time from filing to resolution will increase because the tenants will actually, at least for those for whom counsel is appointed, because the tenants will actually have time to work with their attorneys, to do discovery, to negotiate meaningfully and effectively. And the courts are now they've adopted standing orders that automatically guarantee at least a week of a continuance so that counsel can effectively prepare. We have advised, because this is an appointed counsel program, we have advised the courts that they have to hold to manage their expectations from what used to be a kind of in court, 30-second, go outside, negotiate, come back kind of a deal, into much more of an appointed counsel model like they do in the child rep area, the parents rep area, and in the criminal justice arena. Nobody would require a criminal defendant to go to trial the day that they were appointed counsel, and we've made that very, very clear to the courts here.
And Natalie, you had a comment? Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Jordan.
But I'll just say, in New York, the case often would come back after a resolution by way of a filed order to show cause, requesting additional time to pay out on a judgment or additional time to prolong the period before eviction in order to secure a place to a new place to live. While motion practice in cases increased, and this doesn't necessarily speak to case pendency times, but in terms of activity, while motion practice increased, the number of those orders to show cause dramatically decreased. In Bronx County, where the majority, or where the largest county within New York City where cases are, there was more than one order to show cause as a rate compared to each filing, meaning there was like 1 point something orders to show cause per case filed. That number has dramatically decreased. The timelines for payment might be somewhat longer in some cases, but tenants are able to actually make the timelines requiring a lot less judicial intervention in order to hear the order to show cause, extend a period of time to pay or before an eviction can be executed, making for just a much more efficient process overall.
Thank you, Jordan. And Natalie?
Yeah, I mentioned this in the chat earlier, but just in response to both the last question and this question, I really wanted to encourage Maryland in this direction, which is that even before we were selected as the administrator, I put out an RFP for TA and evaluation so that we could determine what metrics we would be gathering and really work that out before the program begins so that we can answer all of these questions and so many more. And largely, I mean, there's a lot of reasons for that, especially, you know, being one of the first programs, we want other programs to benefit from, you know, what we do well and what we could learn from ourselves. And, but especially because our program is fully funded through federal ARPA funds that, you know, are only going to get us through the first 2 years. And so we really need to demonstrate the benefit of the program in order to get a state appropriation in 2 years. So I know that you guys are chasing funding too. So I just wanted to emphasize that. And I did share our RFP, and just to plug, I largely borrowed from the Cleveland example and how they did that, because I thought they did that very effectively.
And as to the timeline, you'd mentioned that your focus is on getting counsel assigned before court so that you're trying to decrease default rates.
Yes, that's right.
Can I just add a plug for that as well? I mean, I know that I've heard it mentioned even since I've come on about the necessity of early appointment, but it's, and I think it was Jim that said there's no other context in which attorneys are expected to represent someone the day they show up. One of the things that we've talked with some jurisdictions is like where the tenant comes in and the attorney, that contact is not made, that there has to be like a mandatory continuance that's issued, you know, by the judge, that it needs to be in either in the statute or in court rules that says like it's automatic. You know, this is not something the judge gets to decide to do. It has to happen. And that's really, you know, that's one part of it. But the outreach and education work that happens before, and whether or not, you know, there can be some forms of proactive outreach that legal aid can do to people who are on the docket before, you know, the question's always like, are you relying on people to call you, or are you going to try to reach them? Like in the balance of that, like, you know, this is a heavily disempowered population because of the way the system has been run for so long, and expecting, again, people to respond to even a letter saying you may have a right, you know, the ability to get a lawyer in this environment, especially in Maryland. I mean, Maryland has been a really difficult place for a long time for tenants. And so it's just really emphasized how critical it's going to be to get that early intervention and get the counsel to them before really early as possible in the process.
Thanks. And Jordan, do you want to speak to that? Because your program focuses on, you know, accessing at court, within the court.
Well, what I'll say is that has been a product of the fact that many people don't access prior to court. We do have mechanisms set up in order to connect people prior to court. And as I said, we have a complicated rotation to ensure we know and providers know who and when they will be taking those cases, and we do a fair number of them. But that will never account for everyone. And so in a lot of ways, the in-court access is programmatically the exception and not the rule. But practically speaking, so many people are not really engaging with their case or taking advantage of available services until they're in court. And again, I can't underestimate or sort of under-describe the importance of the judicial imprimatur in communicating the importance of counsel. Just by simply saying from the bench, you have access to free legal services in this case. Again, here in New York, the mandate is on my office and not the court in order to appoint that counsel or make that counsel available. But hearing from a court goes a long way. There's another sort of more abstract impact, and that's just being in court. Again, these are pre-COVID days, and seeing other people in the courtroom take advantage of the services in the same way. That's different than any kind of outreach that could be done, and we are looking forward to partnering with CBO partners here in New York to get the word out. We have an ad campaign that should be going up once we reach some clarity with what the actual legal landscape is with eviction protections in the midst of COVID. All of that will be enormously beneficial in getting the word out and acclimating tenants who might be on the fence in order to take advantage of services. But the means of access needs to align with people's lives, and people's lives often involve dealing with their case when they are in court, and that's why we think the in-court access point is so important.
Okay, I think I have two more questions coming from the chat that I'm not sure whether we've addressed directly, and they really have to do with kind of the process, how this works. One is about a tenant who might call, not going to the hub or the intake provider. Do they get referred back to the kind of that central location so their case is captured? So that's sort of a procedural question, or do they, how does that work? And then for the programs, what percentage of tenants seeking counsel are utilizing this service multiple times in a 6-month period? Both of those questions. And then that's the end of the chat questions for now.
Well, in Washington, as it relates to tenants who don't access the hub, as I said in the chat, any tenant who shows up unrepresented must be informed by a judicial officer of their potential right to counsel and where and how to access that. And we're actually working very closely with each one of the courts to facilitate timely and prompt referral to the screening line. There are many tenants who don't have access to technology, who don't have the ability to follow up in the manner that they would like. That's one of the reasons why we are spending a lot of times with community-based partners to make sure that they can help facilitate, even for tenants who in our state, we have these unfiled cases, but they're technically commenced, making sure that they get connected, and they do so through and with the help of these buy-in for and community-based organizations.
I think at any point in contact in San Francisco, ideally they're getting referred back to the hub, which is us, and then we send them out. I think there's a great space for improvement on that. It'd be nice if there was just even, one phone number or something, and then it would route you from there. But ideally, that's how our system is supposed to work. I'm sure we're missing lots of people.
I just wanted to add a quick point about, this is not exactly related to this question, but the point about judicial buy-in. Sometimes there can be a dichotomy between what judges feel about the right to counsel and what the clerks feel, because the clerks are often the ones who are dealing with the pro se litigants, not the judges. They're their front line. And it can actually be really important to talk to them and enlist their support, because in my experience, they usually are pretty supportive of right to counsel, because they're dealing with the brunt of it. And getting their support, I think, can be helpful. And there are ways to deal with any judicial reluctance. Again, looking at the statistics and looking at the data about what limited data there is about the fact that it hasn't dramatically impacted courts that have been doing this. And I don't know if Jordan mentioned this earlier, but the judges in New York testified positively, saying this has been a positive influence on our process. Like, they were the first city to have it. There are how many new lawyers in New York? 800. And they are saying this is a positive development for us. I'll drop that link in the chat just in case you haven't seen it. But just to mention the clerks too, they're an important part of this.
Thanks, John. Natalie?
Yeah, I don't know if this will directly translate elsewhere, but to the extent that it does, I just wanted to note that because the notice of the program has to go out from landlords, owners, subsidy providers, and everything, all the like in Connecticut, we also had our Marshal Commission make all judicial marshals aware of the requirement, so that when a landlord, hires them to, provide service to a tenant, the marshal can also make the landlord aware, you don't have this attached here. You need to be including that when we provide service. So I just, in addition to the clerks, which we're also working with Judicial to make them aware, and they've been actually very good about doing that. I just wanted to put in a plug with the marshals as well.
And did you have to do training for the judges as well as rule changes in each of your instances?
We worked with the Statewide Judicial Association, and we did do training for the judges. They recorded it. We had the initial training had 72 judicial officers on, so that's been good. And we have sent out and coordinated with, we have a standing meeting with dedicated housing court judicial officers, and we have sent out now 6 update memos between May 15th and September 30th, and invite regular and very active communication, not only on the statewide basis, but directly between our local RTC contractors and the bench.
This is Jordan. We do regular trainings with judges. Sometimes they are formal presentations. Sometimes they're just sort of meetings to discuss logistics. But I think you can't overstate what the culture change ends up looking like in housing court. Not just, there's a small sliver of judges who might resist because of the increase in work. The larger group are judges who might be skeptical or concerned because they have been effectively operating in a pro se court for so long and doing the work that is appropriately attributed to counsel for the tenant, explaining the legal situation, ensuring that all stones are, no stones are going unturned in terms of highlighting available assistance. There are judges, very responsible judges, who take great pride in running a court that is fair to a pro se tenant. This is a different job for the bench when you have lawyers on both sides. And so the culture change is significant for everybody involved. Another word on culture change, which I think is important, and that's on the part of legal services providers. Civil legal services providers have spent a long time with, to speak to Natalie's point, with scarcity of resources and the requirement that they pick their shots, and just a universe in which not everybody gets help. That means that cases that are challenging and clients that are challenging, maybe even unpleasant, have often gone unrepresented for very good reasons, maybe not the unpleasant part, but for very good reasons. So, so-called unwinnable cases or no defense cases. We are now in a world where there is no such thing as an unwinnable case or a no defense case. Might be an unwon case, but not unwinnable. And getting providers to get into that everyone gets a lawyer mindset is a challenge, particularly lawyers with a wealth of technical experience in housing law, but also a wealth of experience in using their very limited resources wisely and not providing access to all.
And I noticed, Jim, you concurred that changing the legal aid culture will be your biggest lift.
We're already experiencing the challenges. We have, the legal aid culture here has always been, let's get along, let's find the quick solution, and let's not make the judges angry. And what we're telling them, particularly in jurisdictions where judges are hearing cases prior to certification of right to counsel, that they need to challenge that, and they need to make a record, and they need to take it up on appeal, on interlocutory appeal, and they need to challenge all the writs, because those are illegal. And it's a real, it's putting our lawyers in a position of low comfort. It's not what they're used to doing, and it's, we're basically importing, because two of our best lawyers happen to be imports from New York City. We are really importing the New York City kind of mentality into and building around that.
I just want to second Jordan's point. That's an excellent point as far as the culture change in legal aid. I fully endorse that. That's well said.
Well, it sounds like there's culture change all around. It's rent court, certainly, how it operates, and the legal aid culture, in how we do business. And it certainly will be a big shift in Maryland. So we really thank you. We're at the end of our time. I think we got through all the questions in the chat, and you were very generous in answering a lot of them as we went along too. So I appreciate that.
There's one left from Rena that I think is worth hearing from people.
Oh, please.
If you can give them a minute, because I think it's really important.
Oh, yeah. No, that is important. Can you each talk about the landlord support for right to counsel? Because I think there's trepidation in that culture too. It's a big shift. It's a big change from certainly how we operate in Maryland, but I'm sure in your jurisdictions as well. So let's take a minute for that, with your indulgence.
Sure. Just briefly, the largest landlords advocacy group for rent-stabilized buildings in New York City has come out in favor of the right to counsel. I think that there are always legitimate concerns about how the program's operated, how efficiency in the system, and we take those concerns very seriously in administering the program. But as a principle, there is widespread support for the idea that tenants should have lawyers.
Anyone else? Ryan, Natalie?
I'm not sure we have that same support in San Francisco, just because I hear a lot of, this is more lawyers, litigating frivolous cases that should be gone, and this is, net bad for everybody. But I will say on the subsidized landlord side, I think they generally are happier. This is anecdotal, but I think they generally are happier to have a counsel on their side, because frequently those are, they're coming into the eviction case with they do want to keep the tenant there. It's just a matter of doing the logistics. So I think they're appreciative of counsel, but I think mixed, yeah.
And in Seattle, which is one of the most recent cities that passed, the landlord lobby basically said, we're fine with right to counsel. They had bigger concerns about the other reforms that were being proposed. But on right to counsel, they said, yeah. And I think one of the reasons why they say that, and why they don't often come out too strongly against right to counsel publicly, is because 80+% of them are represented. If it weren't necessary to be represented, why are they represented at such incredibly high rates? It's a little hard to make that argument that it's not necessary, especially when they're not the ones whose homes are at risk. So it's I think that the landlord sort of approach and perspective on right to counsel has really changed in the last decade, I think, as a result of a lot of education work.
So I'll just say in Connecticut that their primary opposition to the legislation came from landlords, which is not surprising, but there are 2 landlords represented on the work group. And so far, we've been very collaborative on that. And it'll be interesting, once the program gets up and running and we get into more specifics, how you know, their contributions to the work group change, but I'm really actually very grateful that they're there so that we have them to voice whatever opposition that is and to be able to respond to it in, you know, in real time and to take it into account. So I'm grateful for that.
Great, thank you. And I think Natalie McSherry asked if you could share any of that, the press releases or whatever that in New York where they expressed their support, or in Seattle. I think that was you, Natalie. Was that?
It wasn't, but it's a good question, so I'll take
it.
it.
Okay. Oh, wait, it was Natalie Wagner. Sorry, Natalie, wrong Natalie. Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate it. This has been just an enormous amount of information, great insights from all of you. You know, we're going to be breaking into some committee work to really dig in and work on our funding and implementation plans for the program. So we may reach out to you again or some of your colleagues to help really come with more particularity on some of these questions. But this has been a wealth of information. We are completely indebted to you and really grateful for your time. It's been recorded. I think Stu asked that question, and yes, this session is recorded. I know I'm going to need to listen again because there's just an incredible amount of downloaded information. And to remind our task force, the materials from each of the jurisdictions are up in the Google Drive, and we encourage you to take a look at those as well. And again, we may come back with you to you for some more questions, but thank you so much for your time. This was a terrific way to launch our work. And we're not done. To the task force, we'll be meeting again tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. We're going to be meeting with the Judiciary. So we have a lot of insights from all of you and some things to talk to with them, in addition to hearing information from them. So thank you very much, and we appreciate your time. Bye-bye.